Welcome to the Gentleman's Guide to Gaming. We take a brief voyage away from Vampire the Masquerade and Werewolf the Apocalypse, where we have been focusing most of our World of Darkness energies recently, to visit the far shores of Wraith the Oblivion. Now, there's a lot of people who will tell you that Wraith the Oblivion is their favourite World of Darkness game, and then in the same breath they will say, but I can never find anyone to play it with. Those people are fools. Every single one of them. And there's a reason for that. Now, Wraith is a fantastic game. It was a pioneering game, I would say innovative, well ahead of its time, both thematically and mechanically. And there's often the cry of, I really want to give it a go, but I don't know who to play it with. Now, I remember once when I was in a conversation with Richard Dansky, the probably most well-known developer of Wraith the Oblivion, where he said, if everyone who said that they didn't know who to play with just went on the same forum, they'd be able to find something like a dozen gaming groups at the same time. And those forums exist, everybody. The Onyx Path forum is there. The Onyx Path Discord is there. And Start Playing are there. That is 3 different venues where you can pitch up your shingle. You can say, I want to run Wraith the Oblivion. And there lies the issue. There's a lot of people that want to play Wraith, but there's not a lot of people who seem to want to volunteer to run it. So, let's solve some of this problem. Let's talk about how to run Wraith the Oblivion. So maybe it will give you the confidence to give it a go. And then the players will flock towards you. Hell, you can even use the comment section below to recruit your players. Obviously, people who want to play games with me running will need to sign up to my Patreon, patreon.com/Matthew Dawkins, where I was until relatively recently running a Wraith the Oblivion Chronicle and may indeed be picking one up again very soon. Because Wraith is a popular game on my server. So, first things first. Do you know what Wraith the Oblivion is? You don't? Okay, in Wraith the Oblivion you play someone who has died. And whether fortunate or not, you have been brought back to a semblance of life. In Wraith the Oblivion, you are not a ghost that haunts the Skinlands, that is the realm of the living. You are an inhabitant of the Underworld, a place that is inhabited by wraiths like you. And the Underworld is a very dangerous, miserable place, where outside the bastions of civilization, where things like slavery are incredibly commonplace, where souls are beaten down to form architecture and crafted into coins, minted into coins, there are destructive tempests that will just annihilate spirits. There are spectres, the dead, who cannot basically cope with their angst anymore and just become horrendous beasts. And of course, every single wraith has a shadow, a voice inside them. You could call it an id. It is something a little more like a destructive superego that is trying to push you to become a spectre, essentially take complete control over you and what resembles your life. So your purpose in Wraith the Oblivion is to come to terms with your passions, with your fetters. Your passions are the things, your motives, emotional motives that keep you hanging around. And your fetters are they tend to be physical objects, people, places that keep you around, that allow you to haunt places. You can access the Skinlands, the world of the living, but you don't tend to be able to stay there for too long. So it's mainly about the politicking, your interactions with fellow dead, and finding almost a second life as you pursue your path towards some kind of, I guess, harmony, some kind of acceptance, transcendence, you could call it. And indeed, that is what the game does call it. Because eventually, you can go one of 2 ways. You either transcend, and no one knows what happens when you transcend your current form, or you succumb to oblivion. If you succumb to oblivion, well, there's a fair expectation that you are utterly destroyed. I guess the third option is you can linger in eternity, but eventually your memories will fade and you'll forget who you were and you'll become a shadow of your former self. Pardon it, fully intended. That is Wraith the Oblivion. Doesn't sound like a terribly cheery game, but the one thing I will tell you is Wraith is not a one-size-fits-all game. Different people are going to run Wraith in very different ways, and here is point 1 on my how to run Wraith the Oblivion. Play Wraith as written only with people you trust. Now, that may sound counterintuitive to the idea of signing up to a random online game of Wraith the Oblivion, and it is. Because Wraith the Oblivion has a mechanic, and as I say, it's pioneering. It was released in the 90s. This mechanic at the time was wholly new. These days you get a lot more innovation in the average indie game, but at the time, the idea was your character has a shadow, and your shadow is played by someone else at your gaming table, in your gaming group. Likewise, they have a shadow, and that is played by someone else in the gaming group. And this could basically lead to players trying to interfere with each other's characters' actions, trying to whittle them down, break down their psyche, make them weaker, and succumb to oblivion. In a sense, becoming a PvP atmosphere. Except in responsible hands, in hands of players who trust each other, who know each other's limits, and will respect each other's limits if you push them, it's all there to serve a story purpose. In the hands of griefers, people who basically are just there to play a shadow to troll, then you're doing it, well, you're going to have a less pleasant experience. So, don't play it as written if it's with people you're playing with for the first time. Instead, the storyteller should take on the role of everyone's shadows. This sounds like a fair burden, but it isn't, because the storyteller will already be controlling the voices and actions of numerous NPCs that exist in the world of Wraith the Oblivion, and all it takes is for the storyteller to give each of these shadows a slightly different personality. Now, the way I do this in Wraith is, yes, I can have an abuser shadow be all speaking like this and rather pantomimey. Yes, you want to put yourself up for sacrifice, don't you? You want them to violate you, don't you? Is, you know, an abuser, whereas you've got a more Stormcrow, depressive kind of shadow who's going to be more resigned. Why are you doing this? Why are you even performing these actions? You know it's futile. You achieve nothing in life. You're certainly not going to achieve anything in death. And then you will have the more psychotic kind of shadow, which is pushing a character to fury, to rage, to doing things in extremes. You're going to have another kind of shadow that is more cleverly manipulative, who's going to be reinforcing all the negative aspects of you. That was a very good decision that you made just there. I'm honestly impressed. I'm going to back off from you because I don't think I need to do anything. At which point, the player and the Wraith will start second-guessing themselves. Now, you can do that with slightly different inflections. I often run, on my Patreon server, our games are audio only. I prefer audio only games. I know that isn't to everyone's tastes, but I find it allows people to relax a lot more than when they're all having to present on camera. And so what I do to really get something different out of all the shadows is I'll manipulate my face in different ways while I'm talking. And I know that sounds very odd, and I've never done this on camera before. But if we go with the Stormcrow, the sort of manic depressive, I will tend to have my jaw clenched like this while I'm talking because it just sounds utterly bored and like I really just can't even be bothered to move my face to communicate with you. Whereas when I'm speaking more abusively, I will have a permanently fixed grin on my face because it makes my voice go up like this. You should try it. When you talk with a smile, you will sound different, especially if you're conscious of it. Now, this will give every single shadow a different flavour. And I've seen other people in in-person groups do it with masks. You know, they'll swap masks for shadows, and that can be beautiful as well, but you don't have to go that route. Now, that's how I would handle the shadow. How would I handle the actual reason, the raison d'etre? Well, it tends to be one of the easiest World of Darkness games to give players purpose. This is point 2 on how to run Wraith the Oblivion. What is their purpose? Well, they will write that in themselves. They will write in their regrets. They will write in the things they have left undone. They will write in the things they will still seek to do from beyond the grave. But that doesn't necessarily join characters together. So something I like to do is have characters die. We will start the game as everyone is mortal, and it will be advertised quite openly that by the end of this session you will die. And I will have them die within proximity of each other. Now, you can do this in a very simple way. A bus crashes, falls off a cliff into a ravine and everyone dies. But that's boring. You are better served by having everyone die in a slightly different way. They can be in the same area, but having different deaths not only gives them different appearances, because remember, in Wraith the Oblivion, your corpus is going to at least vaguely resemble, in its default state, the way you died. At least that was the case in one of the editions. I think in another it becomes your ideal version of yourself, but regardless, I like the idea everyone has a slightly different death. So, as an example, in the Wraith game I ran most recently, everyone was on board a cruise ship, and that ship sank. And one of the characters was murdered by their spouse because they were in an abusive relationship just before the ship started sinking. He literally strangled and beat her to death. Another character fell into the water and died of hypothermia. Another character drowned, got trapped in their cabin and couldn't get out. Another one suspected he was poisoned. It turned out later in the chronicle that he had just had a heart attack because he basically died of natural causes because of all the hell that was breaking loose around him. Essentially, you can go through these various different death methods because that will eventually tie them to things like legions, which is a part of the Wraith the Oblivion setting. We won't get too deeply into the setting side of things in this video, but yeah, the idea is it gives everyone a unique flavour. If everyone just dies in a blazing ball of fire, yes, that creates a certain mutual attitude, but it doesn't create a great deal of flavour. So that's something I suggest. Now, having them all in the same proximity allows you to play a Grim Fandango-esque reaping, where all of the characters are in their calls, their sacks, as it were, and a reaper saves them all and will ferry them, or even though you could use a ferryman here, to Stygia, or some other necropolis-based underworld city, across the Tempest, and to safety. Now, the way I did it was indeed their bodies or their calls were fetched out of the Tempest, out of the water, by this ferryman, who was basically preparing to trade them to Stygia. Eventually they persuaded him against it. In fact, they found another vessel. A host of spectres swarmed their boat at sea, and the ferryman went overboard, and they found another ship, a ghost ship, sailing. And this was the first part of their chronicle. They were bound together because they'd been in the same disaster, and now, well, this ship was their potential salvation. Maybe this would take them to Stygia. It turns out it is a spectral version of the Titanic. Now, I appreciate this is going off on something of a tangent, but the idea is when you put characters in extremis, put them in a situation where they don't necessarily have control over the environment, they will find themselves bound together. And given that they've just been through the trauma of death, they are now basically doing whatever they can to cling to whatever spark of life they have. They will very quickly find a reason to work together, especially if it turns out that the spectral Titanic is not a safe haven. I mean, who would think the Titanic is unsafe? It gives them a colourful setting. Use something like that. That is one of those things I think people should insert in their Wraith the Oblivion games a little more often. Known disasters, known serial killers, known events and incidents that involve mass death, because it is a way of creating relatability. One of Wraith the Oblivion's greatest flaws, and I will shortly get on to part 3, is that it is the only, or one of the only, World of Darkness games that isn't explicitly set in our world. Much like Promethean the Created for Chronicles of Darkness, which is more than any other game a moving Chronicles of Darkness game, Wraith the Oblivion is a game that's set in the underworld rather than our world. It's very easy, comparatively, to make a Chicago by night. You find your city, you populate it with vampires, and your characters will occupy a certain territory within it. You'll get to know your NPCs, you'll get to know various nightclubs. There'll be familiarity, and that is a good way of creating comfort for players as well as their characters. In Wraith the Oblivion, there is no comfort. You're in an alien world where the laws are very different and quite draconian. And so, this is part 3. Find things that you can insert into your game that the players can relate to. I use the Titanic as an example. Any major disaster is a very good way of bringing people together, especially if it turns out as they're boarding this Titanic, to keep using that example, that maybe the spectres on board aren't aware that they are constantly caught in a loop where their ship is going to sink and more of them are going to be lost to the tempest. And then some of them raise the Titanic like that god-awful movie, and they keep sailing, but they're going round and round in a circle, hitting another iceberg. More of them are lost. Or maybe they're making sacrifices on board the ship so that eventually the Titanic will reach the necropolis of New York. You insert these things because relatability is good. That kind of trait in an RPG is what players will suddenly wake up for, because everyone has a touchstone as a player to this medium. So even though Stygia, as an example, is the core setting for Wraith the Oblivion, I would suggest only setting your game there if you are very comfortable with creating a pretty alien metropolis that will go on eternally. I mean, it has that metropolis from Cult Divinity Lost feel. Alternatively, go for a necropolis that you are familiar with. Go for a city that you know, just as you would in any other World of Darkness game, and just make the shadow version of it. Old buildings that have been demolished, old famous people that lived or died in your city or preyed on people in your city can exist here. Relatability is a very strong aspect that a lot of people forget with Wraith, and they end up feeling utterly lost because of the potential expansiveness of the setting. So that's point 3, make it relatable. So let's remind ourselves. Point 1, unless everyone knows each other pretty damn well, the storyteller should play the shadows and respect their players' limits. Point 2, have everyone die in unique ways, but in a close enough proximity that through death they are unified. Point 3, relatability. Bring the characters into something that the players immediately recognize, so it doesn't feel like they're in an utterly alien world and they have no idea how to put their foot down on the pedal or change gears. So let's get on to point 4 now, and that is to keep it personal. Wraith the Oblivion, perhaps more than any other World of Darkness game, is or stands the chance of being the most personal, because every player will have had some connection with death in their life. You know, who hasn't had a loved one die at some point? Usually an elderly relative, but not always. Sometimes we've experienced tragedies in our lives, lost friends in car crashes, lost parents at a young age, sibling fell off the monkey bars and broke their neck, that kind of thing. And therefore it can feel very emotional in Wraith the Oblivion when you start dealing with characters who have had their lives truncated in such ways. But making it personal to the characters rather than the players is the key here. You're not setting out to traumatize them as the storyteller. You want the story to apply to the character, so the player, if they want to channel their trauma through their character, that is obviously up to them. Obviously, I recommend therapy more than doing that, but it can lead to very good roleplay if they're responsible with it, if they know how to handle their limits. How do you make a character's journey personal? I mean, how do you make horror personal for the dead? I will go back to some of the examples from my previous chronicle of Wraith the Oblivion. You have, for example, one of the characters, Courtney, in the Wraith the Oblivion chronicle I ran. Her brother had disappeared and probably died several years of an overdose. She was a failed child star who basically grew into her teenage years and 20s and never hit the same heights as she did when she was on the Disney Channel or Nickelodeon or whatever, and her brother used to perform with her. He took the wrong slip road off of life and died very young, and now she's searching for him in the underworld. She wants to know, did he find peace? Is he still out here? When she finally encountered him, and that was a pretty long arc, it was through going through various of the bureaucracies that exist in Wraith the Oblivion. There is a lot of bureaucracy in Wraith the Oblivion. That doesn't sound very exciting, I grant you, but it is a very Beetlejuice feel to things, where forms have to be filled out in triplicate, where there's so many dead. You basically all need to be filed in the right places. You ended up having a wonderful scene by the end of it where she finally meets her brother, who can vaguely remember her because the toll of death has been heavy on him, and by basically bathing in the river Styx a little too much, you can lose your mind. But she can find some peace. She can finally reconnect with her brother. She can apologize to him for not being there for him when he needed her the most, and he can apologize for abandoning her when she most needed him. You make these personal connections in your games because it gives the game weight. Those touchstones, those Titanics, are wonderful ways to ground your group and make it relatable, as I say, but they're not necessarily going to give you much emotional resonance. Making it personal for the characters, giving every character something personal is, I think, so important. We had another character who was a US Marshal who died on his last case, essentially. And one of his regrets, he lived in permanent guilt that his first partner, the person who basically pulled him into the job or trained him on the job, was gunned down due to an error that he made on their very first case. Or at least that's what he told himself. And it transpired during the course of this game that much of what led to his being here was his partner, now a spectre. Maybe he had been a wraith for some time, but now he was a spectre in the underworld, had basically engineered vengeance against our US Marshal player character. He had engineered his death. He had engineered all the torments that went along, that followed, and ultimately confronted him to say, now I've worn you down. You led to me being here. Well, I have completely whittled you down. Of course, our US Marshal character, Flint, I should say. His full name was Clinton, and his nickname was Flint, confusingly. Sort of rose up from this and beat back the Spectre with the help of the rest of his circle, the player characters. It was a personal moment. We've also had things like characters being able to reach out to a living relative who's mourning them and basically say, it's okay. It's such a archetypal ghost-style thing from any kind of movie or media, but it can really work. Play up the dead's relationship with the living, and even visit the world of the living when you can, but don't overdo it. I think the temptation is to make Wraith the Oblivion a game which is all about hauntings and existing in the Skinlands, and you can do it that way. But I think if you want to get the most out of the game as written, maybe not the rules entirely as written, but the game as written, it's worth spending time in the underworld and getting to terms with the fact that you are dead, getting to terms with this new society, and, of course, building bonds with your circle. So that's going to be all for now. This isn't some grand sweeping, this is the full chronicle that you would run of Wraith the Oblivion, I'm afraid, because we're already over 20 minutes in. I've heard a fair amount that people are very enthusiastic about playing the dead in Curseborn, because of course I'm going to mention Curseborn. The Kickstarter's still going and it's going very, very well. And I was the person, I wrote the initial draft for the dead. They've changed a little, but much of my idea is still in there. I love the idea that each dead family was tied to a specific emotion, because one of the things I really loved of Wraith the Oblivion was passions. I loved the idea that Wraiths are driven by the desire to do this, the desire to make amends for that, the desire to never do this again, that kind of thing. And that felt very emotional to me. The idea that you have your crow-style furies in Curseborn who want vengeance, who want to right a wrong. You have your shades who are more likely to prey on sorrow. They are more likely to, I guess, rather than fulfill the role of vigilante, they are more likely to set the record straight. They want all evidence of misdeeds unveiled. And you have the Zeds, of course, who are all about finality, ending things completely, especially for people who have overextended their life or unlife. And while none of that directly like-for-like matches with Wraith the Oblivion, and it was never meant to, I can certainly look at Wraith as my favourite World of Darkness game and say I can see where the inspirations came from. That there's so much of the writing of Jennifer Hartshorn, of Richard Dansky, of Bruce Bohr, of so many of those wonderful authors who worked on Wraith that has inspired me in my work on The Dead for Curseborn. That I think if you do want to play a Wraith-style game which is set in our world, where you have died and you have been given the blessing or curse of sticking around a little, now is your chance to make amends. Now's your chance to try again. You're not going to be able to maintain the same body for too long. Every time you leave it, it's going to rot a little more. But this is your opportunity to do it right. And I love that idea. It's such perfect personal horror. Do check out Curseborn if you haven't, and if Wraith is what interests you, I've got a link to the 20th anniversary edition below that should come with a discount if you click on it. Now, I will also say, because I've mentioned it before, you are probably one of those people that wants to play Wraith. You are probably one of those people who would love a game of Wraith the Oblivion. There are places you can go. Like you're an alcoholic. You can go to the Onyx Path forum. You can go to the Onyx Path Discord. You can come to my patreon.com/Matthew Dawkins. I can't guarantee I'll be running Wraith yet, but it is always a game that pops up. I've ran it twice on my server now, so it will be coming up a third time sooner or later. But it doesn't have to be me who's running it for you. You can run it. I've just given you the core tools there, at least thematically, the things that you need to run in Wraith to make the game work, rather than telling you the story, telling you the rules, telling you the things you can easily read from your book. So, at risk of this video getting that much longer, give Curseborn your backing, check out Wraith as well, and I will see you next time.